I'm not going to give too much lead into Edwards himself, assuming that he's fairly well known to those of you who are joining us. But there are some brief stats of his illustrious biography, his pastorates and his missionary work, and so forth, just to kind of refresh memories of those who might need to be refreshed. But today we're going to specifically focus in on a practice of Edwards in which he's very much a part of his times. We like to think so much of Edwards as someone who was above it, as it were, or timeless. And here, when we deal with issues of slavery and of race, we're really getting into dealing with Edwards very much as a person of his time, and something that we have to face, right? And we have to deal with, because not just Edwards, but also the people of his time were very much entangled in this. So, acknowledging that from the start of the forced arrival of Africans on the shores of the Western Hemisphere, there have been hundreds and thousands of expressions of resistance to anti-slavery. A lot of attention is heaped upon early colonizers' expression of anti-slavery. Scholars have spent a lot of time trying to find the earliest instances of these expressions, and we usually find them as exampled here in amongst the Quakers in Pennsylvania, and particularly the Germantown Petition of 1688 is one instance of here, authored by Francis Daniel Pastorius. It's a famous piece for our purposes. And then turning to Boston, another example in this sort of chronology is Samuel Sewall, whose Selling of Joseph of 1702 is again seen as a voice that comes out against the slave trade, though there are other aspects of this that, and we could discuss this later, there are other aspects of this that really complicate Sewall as any kind of thoroughgoing anti-slavery advocate. And then another figure of Boston, one of Sewall's friends, is Cotton Mather. And Mather, too, is kind of one of these transitional voices in which he's a slave owner. He defends the institution of slavery, yet he comes out against the slave trade, and he's very much involved in trying to find ways in which to relieve the conditions of chattel slavery for enslaved individuals, and finding other means of reform as well. Even so, the great majority of New England society in its colonial and into its antebellum period was increasingly a society with slaves, and I'm using Ira Berlin's categories here, which many Africans were illegally and inhumanly transported to the Americas, but many of them were in the hulls of New England vessels, and they came to places like Boston and New York City and Newport, Rhode Island. Some of these enslaved ended up being purchased by New Englanders, a small number at first, but growing throughout the 18th century. And many of these New England coastal cities and river towns, including Northampton, Massachusetts, as far inland as that was, where Edwards ministered, were active in slavery-related economic trade in the West Indies and elsewhere. Most settler colonials accepted slavery and the slave trade. They saw slavery, first of all, as biblical, as ordained in the Bible, sanctioned in the Bible, and they increasingly saw slavery as associated with color, blackness being associated with enslavement. particularly as the 17th century drew to an end, and there was less and less English indentured servitude available, and they turned to black slavery, enslavement, black slaves for the purpose of bringing them out of Africa. They also rationalized slavery and the slave trade as means, first, of what they called civilization, based on the premise, the assumption that European societies, and for the English, especially English society, was, of course, the height of civilization. And they also saw them as a means of Christianization. So civilizing people from Africa and then Christianizing them would be the fulfillment of kind of their mission toward these peoples, and a justification for the treatment of them. So slave trading and owning in New England, as elsewhere in the Americas, rose dramatically during the 18th century. Slave owning, along with other mercantilist desires, fine clothes, tea sets, carriages, latest in architecture and so forth, were marks of social status, and slave owning and slave trading were also means of great economic profit. As I mentioned, Newport was one of these centers of the import of individuals to be enslaved. And here's a portrait of Potter family from Manumission, Rhode Island, circa 1740, just as a representative of that. And there in the foreground is an enslaved child. It's a mark of portraiture at this time. This slowly growing New England slave owning class included ministers, and one of them was Edwards. In 1731, Edwards traveled to Newport, and he purchased, as far as we know, his first slave, a 14-year-old girl named Venus. He purchased her, from a mariner who was a slave trader named Richard Martin, and took her back to Northampton. We don't know the circumstances exactly under which Venus was purchased, whether at an auction or through some agents or what have you. But there were various means by which such a transaction could be finalized. Edwards, amongst others, such as George Whitfield and Cotton Mather, for that matter, espoused the ideal of what they called the Christian master. And here we can draw a little bit on the work of Catherine Gerbner in her book on Christian slavery. This ideal dictated that masters should be Christian in their behavior towards their slave, and that includes educating them, treating them as human beings, as objects of charity, and as family members, and evangelizing. And though some ministers preached this ideal, not all of them did, but some of them did, it was one that very few slave owners followed. Edwards himself, as I said, espoused this ideal, and he reflected on it, on his own treatment of his slaves. And here is a entry from his scriptural commentary in his what's called the Blank Bible, which is his main repository of scripture commentary. And he's commenting here on Job 31:13 through 14. And this seems to have been shortly after the time that he purchased Venus. And he talks there about, using the scriptural language, if I despise the cause of my man or maidservant whom they plead with me, and when they stand before me to be judged by me, what shall I do when I come to stand before God to be judged by him? God may justly do by me as I do by my servant. So if I despise my servant's cause, how much more may God despise my cause, right? So that's one of very few kind of first person statements by Edwards, not only on slavery as an institution, but also his participation in it, and even a first person reflection on it. So this is unfortunately, it's not much more than we have or we can find. Part of the practice for at least some colonial slave owners was the manumission of slaves, especially after a long service. In 1740, in her will, Jonathan Edwards's the mother-in-law, basically his wife's stepmother, Mary Hooker Pierpont of New Haven, manumitted Jethro Negro and his wife Ruth, as the will said, in consideration of faithful and good service. And Jonathan and Sarah Pierpont Edwards agreed to act as co-financial sureties. And this was so that the freed persons would not be chargeable to the town, or if in the case that the town wouldn't have to put out funds in order to support them. They did agree to do that in 1740. Later, it's also I think it's important to note, Sarah Pierpont Edwards actively sought to purchase slaves from her husband's colleagues and from family members. So just as her family were slave owners, so too did Sarah Edwards seek to purchase slaves during her own life to help in their home. In the following year, Edwards writes a fascinating draft on slavery. This was only discovered maybe about 15, 25, well, more 20, I guess time flies, huh? 25 years ago now. It seems a short time ago now. But in any case, relative to the rest of the manuscript corpus, this was actually identified fairly late in the game. And it turns out it's a 3-page draft essay in which he's talking about slavery and the slave trade. And what he's doing here is he's apparently defending a fellow minister who is being criticized by his parishioners for owning slaves. And they are criticizing their minister as lustful or as greedy, and seeking profit in untoward kinds of ways. Edwards comes to this person's defense, even though that person is an opponent of the awakenings that happen to be occurring at this time in the summer of 1741. Edwards, of course, is a great proponent of the awakenings, which come to be called the Great Awakening. And indeed, to all appearances, he drafts this piece on slavery only within a few weeks of his preaching his famous sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. Even more importantly, though, the essay draft on slavery is very shortly after the supposed or so-called slave revolt of New York City in February of 1741, in which a trumped-up plot was so-called discovered, and a number of enslaved and free blacks, and even some white people who were supposed supporters, were executed, and not just executed, but burned at the stake. They didn't burn witches at the stake in New World, but they did burn people of color who had been convicted of a slave revolt, of revolt. A very gruesome occurrence. Edwards goes on in this slavery draft on slavery to accuse of hypocrisy those who condemn slaveholding while profiting from slavery and the slave trade, which was a point in contention at this time. The whole idea that if you're going to be against slavery, then you should be boycotting anything to do with it, and including goods that come to you via slavery. He also, though, and interestingly, while he defends slavery, He denounces the slave trade. This is the first time he does this. He denounces the slave trade as a legal disfranchisement of Africans, and even more as an obstacle to spreading the gospel. The rationale for him being that if we're depriving people of their citizenship, forcefully taking them across the Atlantic and putting them in chains, it's going to be very difficult to spread the gospel to their native lands. And this is part of Edwards's eschatological vision that's unfolding at this time in the midst of the awakenings, where he sees the worldwide evangelization occurring in anticipation of the glorious times, as he calls them. A couple of years later, we have this really interesting note from a fellow minister in nearby Amherst, Massachusetts, David Parson, in which it seems that Parson is offering his slave Pompey to be rented to Edwards for perhaps per diem work or for some extended amount of time. It's a little unclear. If you read the transcript of the note, it seems Pompey had some sort of choice in the matter. He didn't want to go. It says, "This comes to you by Pompey, whom I should have sent sooner, but thought it would not conduce to your interest to force him. The Negro, by the advice of my neighbors, is persuaded to come to you. I think he's cheerful in it, and trust you'll find him faithful." Exactly how this matter of choice entered into this is a little unsure, but it points to this practice of people renting out their slaves for labor for one reason or another. Could point out that Pompey eventually went back to Amherst. He married in 1748, and he became a full member of the Amherst Church in 1758. Also, another issue to touch on here, I think, is a theological one that Edwards brings up, at least in part, or alludes to in some of his sermons to the Stockbridge Indians when he goes there as a missionary in 1751. And it's the issue of polygenesis or ethnogenesis versus monogenesis. The theory of polygenesis had been propounded by authors such as Isaac Pereire in his Pre-Adamate, or Men Before Adam, from the mid-17th century. And Pereire and other authors, in order to solve the conundrums that come out in the first few chapters of Genesis about other people existing elsewhere east of Eden and so forth, such as, who was Cain's wife? Who were the people that Cain went to after he murdered Abel and things like this? These authors came up with the theory that there were actually inferior races created before Adam was created. And this became part of a racial theory stemming from biblical interpretation that argued for the superiority first of the Jewish and then, of course, of the white race. Edwards comes out very squarely against this idea, as did Cotton Mather, by the way, and is a strong supporter of monogenesis. It comes out in his own comments on the first few chapters of Genesis, comes out again in his commentary on Job 31, says we are made of the same human race and God has given us the same human nature. And then in sermons in 1751 to the Stockbridge Indians, for example, he asserts all mankind of all nations are on kind of an equal spiritual and ontological plane. They're all from one source, they're from one creator, and they have equal means of of grace as a resolution to equal guilt in sin. Then we have one more receipt of Edwards's life, in which he's purchasing a slave, 1756, just a couple of years before his death. And he's purchasing a certain Negro boy named Titus, about 3 years old. He's purchasing him from a local merchant, by all appearances, a man named Hezekiah Griswold of Hartford, Connecticut. Should point out that there were a couple of Jonathan and Sarah's slaves named Joseph and Sue, who at the time of Jonathan and Sarah's deaths in 1752 were sold at auction by Timothy Edwards and Timothy Dwight Sr., who were their executors. Titus, after service in the Revolution, was manumitted by Timothy Edwards and given land in New York State. And then it's interesting that the spiritual relation of yet another former slave of the Edwardses, a woman named Rose Binney Salter, was published in the Theological Magazine in 1797. So we have the names of a number of these individuals who were enslaved in the Edwards household, and some idea of the fates of some of them as well. Titus was not manumitted by the Edwardses at the time of his death, as I indicated, and he was listed in the inventory of the Edwardses estate under chattel, along with cattle. Could point out, though, that just a couple here quickly, a couple of his followers took Edwards's ideas of his ethical thought, particularly his notions on the nature of true virtue, and took them and reformed them or reformed them and adapted them to condemn slavery and the slave trade both. That includes Jonathan Edwards Jr., who was a minister right here in New Haven for a long time. And he preached and delivered and published sermons such as The Injustice and Polity of the Slave Trade and of the Slavery of the Africans. Here he comes out using his father's notions of virtue, but also revolutionary principles. He argues from natural rights and other means against slavery and for the immediate abolition of slavery. And then Samuel Hopkins, too, Yale class of 1741, has several publications criticizing slavery. And it was when Hopkins moved from Great Barrington, Massachusetts to Newport, there's that place again, in 1769, that he first encountered slave auctions and became an utter opponent to all things doing with slavery and the slave trade. And also, it may well be that Hopkins was the first one in 1776 to use the language of the Declaration of Independence in a sermon that explicitly condemned slavery in the new United States. The thing with the New Divinity men is that while they advocated against the slave trade and called for the abolition of slavery, calling them sins, they labeled them as sins, they were also, at the same time, colonizationists. That is, they advocated that that slaves, black once freed, should be sent back to Africa. They were against integration. They were anti-miscegenist. And however, Lemuel Haynes, who was greatly influenced by Samuel Hopkins, and so part of this kind of Edwardsian religious culture, did call for the integration of African Americans into the new United States. Lemuel Haynes is an interesting figure, born an indentured servant of white and black parents, and influenced by Edwards and Hopkins. He was the first African American ordained in the Congregational Church. He served several churches in New England, including Granville, Massachusetts. There's a picture of the church and his academy or his school next to it. And he wrote a manuscript essay called Liberty Further Extended, which may well be one of the very earliest abolitionist writings by an African American, and again, strongly argues for integration. So there's our website. Please visit it to look at some of these documents I've shown you, and there's my email if you want to contact me.